I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Welcome to Order from Ashes. Today, I have the pleasure of having my colleague Peter Salisbury on the podcast to talk about his incredible, groundbreaking research that was debuted a couple of days ago in a report called Beyond the Axis. Peter, thanks for coming on Order from Ashes.
Great to be here again.
Peter and a research team over the last couple of years have been digging very deeply into Iran's smuggling network and most recently the Houthi drone supply and assembly network. And the project they did was used a lot of quantitative methods and data gathering along with some traditional qualitative research methods to ask some deceptively simple questions like how do the Houthis source the parts for the drones they build, or how does Iran work with client groups or allied groups to train them and get them to the next level of capability? And they did this very deep, descriptive work that led to, I think, some pretty explosive revelatory findings about how modern war and modern economies work together, and really shown a uh, I'd say a pretty shocking light on the inadequacy of Western policy responses to that modern world. So they writ large did two things. They mapped this new way in which adaptive groups operate in the modern world, and they also shone a spotlight on the huge chasm between government responses to that modern world, and I think more or less made the case that governments are never going to catch up unless they somehow become adaptive themselves. So today on the podcast, I'm hoping Peter can share with listeners some of the top line findings of what they came to understand through this research and in this published report. And then I think we'll spend most of our conversation talking about what the implications of that are for the future, what kinds of next questions this raises for researchers and decision makers, and I guess for militants around the world who are trying to figure out, what they want to build now that they know how to build drones, and maybe some spitballing about how this work helps us understand why the Iran war won't be cleanly resolved and what kinds of successor conflicts we can expect. So, with that setup, Peter, welcome again to Order from Ashes. Can you start off by telling us what you found in the culmination of this research that was published as Beyond the Axis in June?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, myself and a team of researchers started trying to answer what we thought was a pretty simple question, which is how do the Houthis in Yemen get their weapons? So the Houthis have missiles, they have ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, they've got these long-range drones, and at the time they were using them to target ships in the Red Sea and Israel at the kind of height of the Gaza conflict in support, the Houthi said, of the Palestinians. And what we were told was, well, all this stuff is being stuck on dhows, these little sort of Indian Ocean ships, and sent from Iran to Yemen. And as we dug into it, what we realized and we documented in a report that we published this February was that the Houthis had learned to make and assemble a lot of these weapons, often from Iranian components, but where there were alternatives that could be just bought on the open market. They were bringing them in through their own supply chains, including via commercial shipping, on container ships, through multiple different smuggling routes. And what we saw was that it was much, much harder, one, to disrupt the supply chains, the networks that were providing the Houthis with these weapons, because there were so many routes, and one route could quickly replace another. And that rather than being, two or three guys in the Houthi movement who know a bit about missiles, with IRGC and Hezbollah guys right next to them, they were basically building their own military industrial base inside of Yemen. And the point we got to was, particularly with drones, with UAVs, they could probably keep building them even if Iran were to collapse. And what we did with additional funding from Accept, from this sort of UK government funding grant mechanism, was we started looking at whether or not this was true of other groups backed by Iran, other members of the so-called Axis of Resistance. And over time, we saw that this was a pattern with some, not all Axis groups, but some groups were trained to use basic weapons first, then to use these more advanced weapons, missiles, drones, so on and so forth, then to build them. And then there's this other point that we started seeing, which is when groups get to a certain point, they operate much more like you and I might imagine states operate, and they can also start cultivating other actors. And the big example we give in the report is that Hezbollah actually played a pretty big role in cultivating and training the Houthis initially, before the Iranians got seriously involved, and that the Houthis today are spreading bets. They're like a little sort of venture capital unit, just kind of allocating little bets across the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and trying to entice local marginalized groups, but also more established groups like Al-Shabaab in
And
Somalia.
one aspect of this that I think is a powerful explanation of why this works so well is the contrast to the traditional Western model of nurturing or building, let's say, proxy capabilities or even alliances. The Western approach has really centered control. So anytime a Western government wants to give military capability to a partner force, whether that's another state or whether it's a non-state actor, there's so many guardrails built in, right? I mean, we have all these countless stories, whether it's from Ukraine or Syria or elsewhere, where there's tracking devices in every major weapon. There's this real fixation with, which is understandable, although ultimately makes the policies fail. This approach that you're looking at is much more like an investor approach, where the investor doesn't really care what the investment does as long as it makes the money, right? And in this case, the return on investment isn't profit. It's capability to kill or build rockets or drones or whatever the case is. And that is a real mindset shift. And that's part. I mean, one of the things I'm going to keep not bringing the conversation back to, but surfacing in our conversation is the big picture ways in which this Iranian-centered approach, which is not unique to Iran, but Iran is the most sort of visible figure doing it these days, really is an embrace of a different, I would say, distinctly modern and maybe distinctly decentralized and lighter on values, or at least it doesn't only require shared values or shared goals to drive it forward.
Mm.
So not to interrupt, but just to augment that point.
And I think there's an important additional point there, which is we debated a lot how to describe the relationship between the different Axis groups as they rose up what we call the capability ladder, as they became more and more capable under Iranian kind of Hezbollah tutelage, and as they became sort of more relational with one another. And the word we landed on was interdependence. When you get to this point where you can build Iranian drones and missiles, and where you're running kind of like a mini state, as Hamas were, as Hezbollah do, as the Houthis do, or if you're embedded in the state, as some of the Iraqi groups affiliated with Iran are, you become more capable. And what people kept on saying was, well, doesn't that mean they're more autonomous? And in many ways it does, but they're really reliant on Iran for the technology, for access to this kind of ecosystem of knowledge sharing between different Axis groups. And what you see is there's no real alternative for them. So they become locked in. Whereas in the West, what happens is there's always a sense of deep transactionalism, that this could be cut off at any moment. The weapons might have kill switches built into them. You're never given that capability. So the relationship actually remains much more brittle over time, and kind of is easier to disrupt and break.
And it really struck me. And I mean, I've had the pleasure of working with you on this research for the last year, and I know you've been doing it for a lot longer before that. It wasn't initially clear to me. Like, one of the questions you came in with was, how do we how do we figure out what's happening in the instances where Iran succeeds at raising a group that it supports to the level of, let's say, a Hezbollah or the Houthis? And we started looking at the many instances where they made such investments which didn't pan out, right? So the sort of, we don't only look at the success stories, we also look at the failures. And one of the things that really struck me was that these relationships from the get-go build in that the client groups are also acting as teachers elsewhere. So it's almost like, in medical school, a medical student is learning in the classroom in the morning, and then is even before they know what they're doing, expected to go out into a clinic and perform. And also, you're being taught and you're also teaching at the same time, which in some ways seems like totally nuts. But it certainly is. It's a very powerful force multiplier, and it's a very powerful way of first of all, seeing which of these groups have the capability, sort of have the confidence and capability to teach others even before they fully know what they're doing. And it's also those groups that can do it will learn so much more and so much faster if they're, like in the Houthis case, they're learning things from Iran, and at the same time they're teaching things to the authorities or to other East African clans and clients. So they are the student, and they're also the boss. They're the buyer, also the seller. And that was revelatory to me, into how this does evolve as a network. So not just quickly, but very adaptively.
Yeah. And the other point that we make in the report is, and again, we kind of debated the right word for this for a long time. Over time, you move from this place where the groups are pretty reliant on Iran. Iran's kind of their only friend. They have some access to their own societies, but they're often quite isolated. And to build these capabilities, they have to expand their networks into kind of business, into finding engineers, into their own societies. They also become more connected to global supply chains, which we should talk about in a moment, and they become more connected to other access groups. And what we found was there have been lots and lots of training camps set up over the years, in particular in Syria, when it was under the control of the Assad regime, and where Iran, Hezbollah basically controlled a bunch of military and air bases. You'd have these cohorts of Hamas, PIJ, Hezbollah, Iraqi groups, Houthis, etc., all in the same camps, all learning the same stuff. So you have the formation of this kind of cohort of groups. And what we keep on hearing is that the Houthis will go to Iraq and they'll work with the Iraqi groups, the Hezbollah and others, on testing drone technology. That Syrian engineers, after the collapse of the Assad regime, have gone to Iraq, have gone to Yemen. So you've got this big kind of like dense mesh network. It's no longer this very sort of simple telephone exchange like thing. And the metaphor we use is the difference between an old world, kind of old timey fashioned telephone exchange where you have to call the central exchange to get routed through to where you want to go, to the internet, where you can get routed pretty much anywhere in the world in a matter of seconds, and where there's this giant base of distributed knowledge, which we really think helps explain how, along, of course, with IRGC, with Iranian support, Axis groups have been able to reconstitute themselves so quickly, even when senior leaders, including kind of the top missile and drone guys among the Houthis and Hezbollah, have been killed.
So yeah, this paradox. I want you to unspool this a little bit more for our listeners, because I think it's both very complicated and also pretty simple when you draw it out. So we have a network that came into being because of state power, in this case, because of Iran's state power and resources put at the disposal of creating this network. But now you argue, I think convincingly, that this network can survive Iran's weakening or Iran's demise because the network has become bigger than it. So, what is this network? Because you've already referred to sort of financial dimensions, supply chain dimensions, pretty traditional import export webs, quite sophisticated weapons manufacturing and sort of technology and design aspects, and of course a strategic policy making dimension, if we can call it that, that is the ability of disparate actors to coordinate some kind of war strategy. So what sketch for us what this network is that has emerged from what seemed initially to be some ad hoc efforts to poke the empire by a revisionist a low to middle tier revisionist power.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the telephone internet um, analogy here or metaphor where 20 years ago, with the exception, let's say, of Hezbollah, most of the members of what we now call the Axis of Resistance were like classic late 20th century insurgent guerrilla groups. So they're running around with AK-47s. They've got some kind of roadside bombs. Maybe that's the most advanced thing that they can put together. They're limited territorially. They're limited in terms of their network reach. And this capability enhancing process has forced them to build out those networks in every direction to connect to one another. And the difference is, back in the day, if you wanted arms as an armed group, you went to an arms dealer or a state, and they had to put it on an old Russian cargo plane or a boat and get it to you. There'd be one or two ways of getting that thing to you. And that could be disrupted, or, the state could stop providing you with arms, the arms dealer could be arrested, and it would take a long time. It would really disrupt you. But when you get to the place where you have your own procurement networks globally that can buy the components for things like long range drones, which are quote unquote dual use, which means they have civilian as well as military use and are often just sold over the counter without any restriction. And you can probably tap into global arms networks. That's just a fundamentally different problem in two ways. One, it's much harder to disrupt the groups. And two, you take Iran out of the picture in the same way that in the early 2000s, if, let's say, for some reason, the entire internet in the United States was shut down, the internet globally just wouldn't work in any way, shape, or form. But now the internet is so large and meshed and distributed and exists in so many places in the world, it would certainly be hugely disruptive to internet services, but the internet itself will continue to work worldwide. And that's true of the Axis as well. These groups wouldn't be completely unchanged. They would certainly be disrupted. They would be weaker. They would be more vulnerable, but they wouldn't collapse overnight. And the capabilities embedded in them, the ability to manufacture their own arms from parts bought from around the world, these strategic arms, which are fundamentally different than the kind of arms those old school insurgents had that can go hundreds of and thousands of kilometers and be used to attack vessels in the Red Sea, just a totally different game, totally different ball game. They'd still have that capability embedded within themselves. So they would still be quite strategic actors, even in the absence of Iran.
So how come the assassinations or sidelining of key central figures has not been more disruptive to this network? I mean, the theory of killing Qasem Soleimani or Imad Muhniya earlier, but also less famous figures, some of whom appear in your report. I mean, there are these. I was about to cite Malcolm Gladwell, but no, they're these sort of connector people who are clearly extremely talented and act as real nodes of knowledge
Mm,
dispersal or of capital accumulation or whatever. And cyclically, these individuals get arrested or detained or turned or killed.
right.
How come that hasn't been more disruptive to the network?
Sure. And it's a really good question. It's something that we pondered a lot. And the answer is that in the same way that with a startup company, it might be that you have two or three people who can do the primary things that that startup does. And if you take one away, the company collapses. If that company succeeds, let's say Qasem Soleimani is now CEO of Quds Force Inc., LLC, then he has built out capability among multiple people within multiple departments of his business who can do all the things that he needs to get done. He is the charismatic leader. He has all the relationships, but the actual day-to-day running of the thing is done by multiple people, and you can remove him, you can remove the heads of departments, and the thing will keep running. That's one. And two, you have again this giant distributed base of knowledge where Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi groups, the IRGC itself, the Iranian state, they're all trying to do the same stuff in different ways with these missiles, these drones, these different weapons that they're using. So you remove the top missile commander. One, he's got people underneath him, and two, there's this just pool of knowledge that you can tap into to work out how to rebuild capabilities where that person is missing, if a manufacturing site is destroyed, if a certain supply line is cut off. It's again, it's like tapping into the internet. It's like being able to go to Google. And you and I are old enough to remember when that didn't exist, when we had to walk to a library
Go to
and
the
look
card
up
catalog.
right? We had to look up a telephone. We had to look in the phone book. We had to go to the library to find things out. And now you can just tap it into Google, and it's a very similar distinction.
Um, so do you want to hit one more beat of what you found before we
Yeah,
start looking forward?
yeah. Let's talk about the global supply chains quickly as well.
All right, just go. You
Okay.
got this.
So the other thing that's important to know here is none of this is possible without this like fundamental shift in the global economy. So we talk about removing individuals, and I talked about this idea of there being arms dealers who used to be called by the FBI used to call them super connectors, right? There were people who were brokers in a global world and were able to access certain types of technology, materials, goods that primarily came from the West. So 20 odd years ago, if you wanted to build a drone like the Shahed 136, which is the really famous drone that the Iranians have been flying into various bits of Gulf infrastructure since the beginning of this year, you needed to go to Germany to get the engine. You need to go to the United States to get the guidance components, so on and so forth. And what's happened over the last 20 years is this revolution in manufacturing where China has gone from being a low-cost manufacturer of kind of cheap, low-tech goods to the world's largest producer of intermediate goods, of really increasingly high quality and increasingly low costs. So where, in 2009, IRGC operatives were trying to get hold of 60 engines to make a drone from Germany, and they got caught. They've been pretending that they were jet ski engines. Eventually, someone in Iran worked out how to reverse engineer that engine, and then a Chinese manufacturer took that bull and ran with it. And the Russian campaign in Ukraine, the Iranian campaign in the Gulf is powered by Iranian-made, Chinese, and to an extent Russian-made versions of that same engine. Now Chinese firms make better versions of that engines, their own engines. So the choke point for supply has moved, and then the actual supply chain has moved because it's moved east. These goods move on container ships. They go through ports and jurisdictions where they're transshipped 10, 20 times in different ways. And those jurisdictions are much less amenable to Western regulation. So what we've seen is you can get hold of the stuff that goes into the drones, including the manufacturing equipment from places other than the West, and the movement of those goods is not regulatable by the West. So you end up with this second point where they can access all this stuff very, very easily from places that the West doesn't have influence over. And the way that we kind of describe it in the report is if you think of people as choke points in knowledge and management, and you think of manufacturers and supply chains, supply routes themselves as choke points, what you've seen is you've gone from these individual points of failure within the axis of resistance itself, but also within these globalized supply chains that the West could interrupt relatively easily to a super, super distributed mesh, both in terms of the way the axis works and in terms of where the stuff that it uses to make its weapons come from. And that's really, really worrying because Western policy is still, and I think actually Operation Epic Fury really proved this point, predicated on this idea that there are people, that there are manufacturers, storage points, there are these choke points in the world that if you can hit them in the right way, you'll cause this cascade of failure. And that just doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the most interesting things to try and understand. I mean, I still, having looked at this closely with you for a long time, I'm still sorting out how I think about some of the implications of this. So let me run through a few of these with you right now. The first is this question of state power. So, you're describing something that's familiar to anyone who, tried to buy something during the pandemic, right? The new globalized supply chains, the reliance on China, the shift from traditional, not just manufacturing, but how and where we get things from. Nonetheless, couldn't China as a state just turn this sector off if it decided to? So, like, yes, it's different. Like, it's no longer American guidance systems and German engines. And you often use this line about how one of your researchers went on Alibaba and saw that he could build a drone for some ungodly low price. What was it?
$1,500, yeah.
Yeah. So that's crazy, wild, new, different. Couldn't China in the blink of an eye, using its central authoritarian control over, it has this very lively market-like economy, heavily controlled by the state. Couldn't it say, we're not doing drones anymore, no more drone parts, end of story?
In a word, yes, it could theoretically. And one of the big questions that we started to discuss with people during the course of the research, and we could only get so far on because this wasn't the main focus for us, was is this a sin of commission or omission? Is the Chinese government aware that all this stuff is going to not just Iran, not just the Axis groups, but to Russia? It's being used to make these drones. And I think post-Ukraine war, post kind of particularly February 2026, when you see all these Iranian-made drones with Chinese and other components flying into, infrastructure in the Gulf states, it's much harder for the Chinese government to say, my goodness, we just didn't know. Um, and the challenge is kind of two or threefold. First, China's a giant export-oriented economy, and it's quite hard to regulate this stuff. So would they be willing to just press a button and kill one or two of their main manufacturers? Second is the Chinese state itself really is investing in UAV and drone technology. It's made what it calls the low atmosphere economy a big part of its next 5-year plan. And you think about the way that it invested in EVs, electric vehicles, and other things, it creates incentives, it builds subsidies for people to make better versions of the same thing. So, if anything, what we're going to see in the next 5 years is new, better, lower cost technology coming onto the market from China that can be adapted into Iranian and other drones, which is terrifying because this isn't just an Iranian axis of resistance problem. And then third is kind of the cost benefit analysis of political leaders in Beijing, where by doing nothing or doing very little to counteract this, it has not yet cost them anything. What is interesting at the same time, though, is that the Chinese state has actually within China become increasingly controlling of the drone space. So if you buy just a cheap sort of off the shelf DJI, one of these little sort of whirly quadcopter drones that you can just buy off Alibaba or even Amazon in China, it has to be chipped. You have to register it and you have to get on an app if you're anywhere near a city and ask for permission from essentially the local police station to fly it. So they're very keenly aware of the domestic threat that it poses. But for now, it kind of feels like, at a minimum, what's happening with drones in the world is costing the United States, it's costing the West, and it's not costing China. So they're going to let it flow. But it could take one or two events to change that. And I would imagine there's going to be a lot of pressure from the Gulf states coming out of the most recent round of a war on China to better regulate and control the movement of these goods.
Great. And so that leads to my next clarifying question, which is the the type of history and mechanism that you chart in this research. What it tells me is that motivated networks can quickly, in sort of geopolitical terms, quickly in a matter of a couple of years, can create alternatives to existing, pathways to, in this case, build weapon systems. So, can we surmise from what you've learned so far that were China to decide to regulate the space or stop exporting it, that if in effect it wouldn't matter in the long term because what this network having achieved critical mass at learning how to replace pathways, it learned, we didn't talk about this and maybe we will, it learned how to create alternatives for financing after, the US led global financial system found ways to shut out actors at all levels after 9/11. This network found a way to finance global trade anyway in an illicit gray space. So why should we act on the assumption that that were China to come to want to disrupt this particular weapons supply space, that the network would find alternative manufacturers, that alternative manufacturers would spring up maybe slightly more expensively at first, but in other zones, that the individual Chinese manufacturers with the know-how would immediately pop up and build new factories in Sudan or in some place where they could spend another 10 or 15 years making money building these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's three things to consider there. First is what China could and would do would probably be take iterative steps towards controlling its export regime for different components. And obviously, what you can do, and this happens a lot, is just set up a shell company in a country near China, and buy your goods. So, in the course of the research, I mean, Hong Kong is a huge center for these shell companies, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, more and more companies buying these parts, then sending them to shell companies in Central Asia and elsewhere. So, what you end up with is kind of like, what is the regulatory model for China? Is it just kind of pressing a button and saying no? And as you say, kind of it's relatively easy to adapt because the economy is so globalized and it's so easy to set these things up. And then the next point is, as you say, what we've seen with Chinese intermediates manufacturing is as Chinese manufacturers move up what's known as the value chain. So as they start making higher tech, higher value goods that they can make a better profit from, often what happens is neighboring countries set up manufacturing to take on the lower value chain. So sort of the lower tech, lower profitability bits of manufacturing. This has happened in various different industries. And you're probably already seeing at kind of like the lower end of things, kind of again, like Vietnamese, Cambodian manufacturers taking on some of these things. So yes, we're in this place where, I mean, somewhat ironically, you can just buy the manufacturing equipment need to make these things increasingly cheaply from China and then offshore manufacturing from China. And I'd imagine that 2 or 3 steps from now is this going to become much easier to build the individual components for these things. So it's all pretty terrifying in terms of where control can be. And I think we say this in the report, you and I have talked about it a fair bit. It's one of those moments where you look at it and you're like, if only there was some kind of giant global multilateral body where we could have a grown-up conversation about controlling this technology in a way that doesn't allow it to proliferate at terrible scale and make wars bloodier, longer, harder to end. And of course, you and I live in New York. We know that it exists, but we also know that its utility has just been gutted over the past 20 plus years.
Right, and I think that's parallel to the sort of gap, the gap between Western governments and this network, right, where one is operating in an old paradigm, and global governance is even further out of step with global realities, right? So the UN and its agencies, even those that are staffed by very able people with great technical capability, there just isn't power vested in that institution anymore. And you think back to something like the Convention Against Chemical Weapons Use, which, I mean, okay, that is probably a lone exception in something where most of the nations in the world really genuinely committed to a voluntary act of restraint because of the horror they felt at the use of chemical weapons, and even that imperfect accord, it's one of the best ones we have, and it's not that great. And that came into being in a completely different world, and more than half a century ago during the Cold War, when the idea that non-state powers or sub-state powers or hybrid actors could do whatever they wanted, and where, like, I mean, we always talk about hybrid actors or non-state actors looking at groups like Hezbollah, but actually, the oil super majors and the weapons there's a lot of non-state actors that operate with international reach and outside of the purview of government control, and many of them are much admired Western corporate agglomerations. And that I don't think policymakers really understand, even those who are trying, really understand what that reality means, that reality in which so many different scaled actors can do things, with some state complicity, and sometimes with no need for state approval at all. So I don't know if you feel free to say something about that, but I wanted to move us in the sort of last chapter of our conversation today into the future looking, and I want to ground that conversation in the Iran war that is, either on timeout or in its resolution phase right now, because for me that's the case study that really illustrates the accuracy of your central findings, and really terrifyingly sets us up for, like, oh God, if that is true, what does that mean as we move into bigger and worse conflicts?
Yeah. And as you know, we were drafting this report as the conflict, as kind of Operation Epic Fury was kicking off. And there were a good 2 weeks where kind of the narrative, the media narrative was Iran is done, the Axis is finished. Um, and I was sitting as I was writing thinking, have we got this terribly wrong? Have we really misunderstood this problem? Because people were so confident. And lo and behold, it turned out that Iran, the Axis groups were in fact a lot more resilient than people had anticipated. They've been able to rebuild their arms stockpiles much more quickly than people had anticipated, and that really fits in with the research. And I think what's interesting right now is that you are seeing the United States trying to get to this very kind of simplistic deal with the Iranians on the basis again that this can have some sort of cascade effect and can take the axis of resistance groups out of commission. And people kind of talking about, well, will they starve supplies to the Houthis or other groups? What will happen to Hezbollah? But one of the things that we saw during the course of the research was that even as people were having this conversation, let's say 24, 25, Assad regime has collapsed. Hezbollah has definitely been decimated at a leadership level and looks significantly weakened. Hamas is lying in tatters along with the rest of Gaza. Is that the Houthis in Yemen, who are kind of generally seen as kind of the hillbillies of the axis of resistance, are actually out in Africa again, building up these relationships and using the carrots of technology transfer with groups like Al-Shabaab, with elements within the Sudanese armed forces, with smaller, more marginalized transporter communities across Africa to start again spreading these bets and seeing who's going to bite and who they can pull up this capability ladder and into this kind of interdependent relationship. One of the things we say in the report, and I found myself saying a lot, is in the same way that, returning to the terrible internet metaphor again, you can't think of the internet as a static thing with fixed points. We can't think of the axis of resistance and this Iranian ecosystem that it's created, which is now self-perpetuating and self-managing, as something with fixed borders. And even as it was contracting in the Levant, it was making this effort at expanding into Africa. And I think that's going to continue in the coming months of years, and it's going to have really difficult and unexpected results. And if we expect the kind of a successful or failed deal between Trump and the Iranian regime is going to change that, then we've really got another thing coming. So if anything, we're going to see these sort of technologies come into the hands of more and more unexpected groups like Al-Shabaab in the coming years, and that's going to have a really terrible set of consequences for conflict.
I mean, like part of what I think is confusing to people, let me start this over. There's been a lot of Western rhetoric over the years that portrays these groups as nihilists, right? As irrational, crazy death cults that want to destroy the West and just there's nothing sort of intentional or systematic or strategic about these groups. I don't think that's ever been true, but that has distorted people's analysis, even sophisticated people's analysis of what these groups are doing. And it seems like, on the other hand, these groups have been pursuing a very clearly stated, rational set of objectives that are easy to understand, that make a lot of sense, especially if you look at their perceived interests and their constituencies. So the the reality today is that many of the constituent groups in the axis of resistance are running their own foreign policies, and those foreign policies move in multiple directions. So yes, there are foreign policies that are about checking Israel or about countering U.S. interests, but then they have many, many other policies that have to do with their near neighborhoods. In the case of the Houthis, their extensive work in East Africa. But there are commercial interests in South Asia. There are strategic partnerships with groups that no one in the West certainly is thinking about, and won't think about until and unless one of those geographies becomes a node of conflict or a node of disruption to the global financial system, or let's say shuts down the world energy market for several months. And looking at this from a cold calculus, there are horrible cases like the war in Sudan, which for some reason major powers have decided isn't that strategically significant to them. So they don't mind what's happening in Sudan, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives and disruption to millions. I think that was for a while the way governments looked at the problem of Syria. On and off, there were times where they were like, well, it's unfortunate, but it's like it's a regional problem. And that tends to be the Western approach, is to hope that that problems or pathologies that are happening somewhere can basically be contained regionally and not rise to the level of being a problem. And inevitably, in this I mean, I think you are showing that the way this world interconnects, it's almost inevitable that a major economic or conflict issue was going to become an issue for everybody. And that's the part that, like, the adaptive actors understand. And by the way, I don't know if you agree with this. I would say the adaptive actors in our system aren't only small or medium powers like the ones you focus on in this axis work, but powers like China and Russia
Mhm.
are acting in this kind of adaptive network approach, and powers like the U.S. and some of the European powers do not. And maybe that's one of the forward-looking questions we can look at, which is who and where is this kind of networked understanding going to spread?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And throughout this research, something we kind of will bump into from time to time is that there are two or three other states who seem to be actively pursuing similar, if distinct, strategies to Iran. So you've got Turkey, you've got the United Arab Emirates, you've got Russia and various other countries who are willing to work with non-state actors and build up their capabilities in different ways and build up this interdependence to serve their own national interests as they perceive them. And I think that this goes beyond proxy thinking. And certainly in the case of the UAE, they've done some pretty deep thinking about what a networked modern world looks like and what it means to be a middle power sitting at kind of the nexus of the movement of goods and people, as the UAE is. And when we try and talk to Western policy makers about this, they're still stuck in a paradigm where they're trying to work out whether or not we're in a multipolar world, right? Uh,
That's
and
the
the thing
question
I
from 25 years ago.
Right. And it's something weird and different and new from how we conceptualize multipolarity anyway. But I think this new paradigm is coming. I think some states and actors grasp it intuitively. And Western states have been so useful to being the dominant power that they can kind of impose their analytical lens on the rest of the world and force it to kind of fit in to that lens. And that works less and less. The kind of exorbitant privilege of being the sole superpower is slipping away from the US. That doesn't mean it's not the most powerful country, but it's just that that power buys you a lot less. And I think this research really points in that direction.
Right, and the conclusion of this Iran war is exactly what you just described. It's like the attempt to impose on reality this fantastical construct that doesn't fit it, and we have the president of the United States saying things about like the freedom of navigation of the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran answering by closing it again just to remind these rhetoricians that you can say things all you want, and you can put things all you want on social media. That doesn't actually change the balance of power on the ground. And I do think there's a fascinating there's a fascinating reversal here, because I remember 20 years ago the way Iran and axis of resistance groups talked about their power seemed delusional, right? So it was a mirror image of Trump today saying, I decide when the Strait of Hormuz is open and closed, and that's no longer true. And 20 years ago, you had these groups saying like, Israel and America are quaking in their boots when we do X, Y, and Z. And back then that wasn't true at all either.
Yeah.
And they've made it a little more true, I think, both by deflating deflating their rhetoric a little bit and increasing their capability. But
Yeah.
it to me, this seems like not an Iranian development or a axis of resistance development. This is you know, I like your terms. This is a networked capability, which anyone could do, right? I mean, this is available to anyone who wants it and is willing to bear the costs, right? I mean, we haven't talked about this much in this conversation, but there are drawbacks to this approach, which include being isolated from many aspects of modern international life that are beneficial to states and societies. So you forego access, let's say, to licit finance, to education, to all kinds of things that people want in exchange for the autonomy and capability provided by embarking this kind of network building. But Europe could do this. Groups could use these capabilities to do things like drilling boreholes and providing clean water, right? This doesn't have to only be used for building, tools
Yeah.
of death. Now, we know that people are much more incentivized to be their best creative selves when it comes to figuring out how to kill more and faster and fight more wars. But the tools are value or sort of goal neutral. You could use these tools for things that you and me, I think, would consider much more attractive.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're quite right. I mean, the exact same supply chains that can be used to build drones are supplying the entire world with low-cost renewable energy via solar panels from China, right? And low-cost internet via similarly sort of cheap technology. So the same global system is doing wonderful things for some people's lives and destroying other people's lives. And we're just not having a grown-up conversation about. And I also think I co-wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs with Emma Beals a couple of years ago, where we asked this question of why conflicts are becoming so hard to end. And you're my sort of former colleague, Renard Mansour, wrote about this in the context of the axis of resistance and also talking about ideas of ecosystems. And at the end of the most recent bout of fighting between Iran and the US, a lot of people were saying Iran has won the war. And the thing that I keep coming back to is it's becoming easier and easier, regardless of the power balance, for different actors to fight each other to a draw, to a stalemate. But it's so easy to access these weapons of war that it's also easy to continue to perpetuate the war rather than feeling incentivized to end it. And I have a sneaking suspicion that all the stuff we're describing right now is pushing us into a place where we see more longer, nastier wars, where multiple external actors are pursuing their own self-interest, primarily in what we'd call the global south, in poor countries, faraway places, where we're just kind of exporting all of this violence and creating kind of forever wars on the periphery but without sort of US or Western boots on the ground. And that really, really worries me because it would be a cheap and easy thing to do. And if everyone's drawing, then you end up in this kind of negative sum game where you're like, well, I might as well make the other guy lose a little bit more. And that's kind of at the back of my mind as I come out of this project as to whether or not that's what we're looking at, if that's kind of like the slightly grim implication of this work.
And the powers, yeah, I think that's the right question. And the powers that have some say over whether we have this continuing proliferation of forever wars in the global south,
Yeah.
have made their calculus often based on the assumption that they won't pay a cost in their own countries, right? So
Yeah.
the comfort with exporting war and violence relies on the belief that you in your state will not be bombed or killed or disrupted, and frankly, I'm not sure whether this recent war with Iran changes that calculus for states like the Gulf powers, right?
Mm.
So they did get caught up in this war in a way that was quite costly to them. Um, I'm not sure whether they will assess over the next couple of years once they are able to rebound their oil exporting or natural gas exporting capability in Qatar's case. Like, will states like Kuwait, Qatar, and the Emirates and Oman, after this settles, say, oh no, this was a bad reality for us. We don't want to live in this. Or will they say, okay, it was a disruption, there was a cost, and we've emerged from it in a satisfactory way, and we are okay with continuing to invest in this type of path. For sure, the global north powers like the EU powers and Japan and the US, those countries would, I think, have no tolerance for, if conflicts spread into their spaces. I think they would suddenly be very interested in finding ways to control and limit these networks that they have aided and abetted. China and
Educated.
Russia are more ambiguous. Not sure. Russia certainly seems to have a high tolerance for this. So yeah, I don't know what you make of that.
Yeah, and maybe this kind of allows us to kind of come back to where we started and wrap it up a bit. But one of the
You can
things,
wrap it up completely.
yeah, one of the things that sort of a big team of people worked on this project. We had arms experts, a guy called Henry Thompson, another guy called Wolf Christian Pace, and what they kept on saying was this conversation will change the day that someone builds one of these low-cost drones or a bunch of these low-cost drones in Europe or the United States or in China and flies it into some buildings or does some really gnarly stuff, we will get a lot more serious, a lot more quickly about this challenge of this new type of proliferation, this new type of knowledge transfer, the minute that it really imposes a local political cost. But as long as it doesn't, I think that sort of policymakers will both be unwilling to invest in constraining these flows in a meaningful way and be willing to look the other way when they themselves and their allies use these weapons and these technologies in really destructive ways.
And you've shown that disrupting this network would also disrupt the legal trade network. And I think that's one of the other secrets, not secrets, one of the ingredients for this dilemma is that we largely, the world, wants the hyper convenience of adaptive supply chains that allow us to buy all kinds of things like air conditioners in Iraq or shoes in Vermont or whatever. And if you were to really regulate trade flows and be able to have visibility on drone parts or whatever the future brings, that is something we would want to disrupt. You can't do that without slowing everything down. Fewer shoes, less drywall for building materials, all kinds of things that I think people universally agree are good. And so that this convenient, fast moving world and this economy that we think we want
Right.
uh, inevitably also creates the opportunity for this. So, Peter, thank you and your team for this incredible deep work. I find it has completely changed the way I understand a lot of not just news, but a lot of big policy questions that I spend my time researching. So I'm really grateful and appreciative of what your cohort has done for us here. I encourage our listeners to read the report. It's actually beautifully written as well. You can find it on the Century Foundation's website. It's called Beyond the Axis. So if you just Google Beyond the Axis and Century, you'll find the report landing page. It is, I kid you not, a fun read. It's got like great vignettes and crazy characters, but also really profound analysis, really clearly put. And since Peter, you've been giving shout outs to people, I'm going to give a shout out to Eamon Kersher Allen, who is the editor who I think worked hand in glove with you and your team to make sure that the final product really captured your best thinking. So please go to the report and read it, and then you will be nervous about new things forever once you're once you're given this insight. Peter Salisbury, thank you for coming on Order from Ashes.
Nancy, thanks so much for giving this work a home. It's been a pleasure working with you. Thank you for everything.
Great. Well, listeners, you'll find us here over the summer. We're not necessarily going to be dropping episodes every week like we have been since the beginning of the year, but you'll be able to find our podcasts here. They'll pop up in your feed. We'll have a couple of episodes over July and August, and then in September, we'll go back to weekly production. Thanks for listening. See you here soon.